World War II is the most documented conflict in human history. Its battles, strategies, leaders, and horrors have been dissected in every imaginable format, from grainy black and white newsreels to high-budget Hollywood epics. And yet, beneath the surface of all that official storytelling, there are voids. Entire pages of the wartime narrative remain missing. Files sealed indefinitely, operations scrubbed from military logs, missions that officially never happened. Ask any honest historian, and they'll tell you, we've only scratched the surface. For every well-known campaign like Normandy or Midway, there are a dozen whispered about missions that defy explanation or simply disappear from view the moment you try to follow the paper trail. British intelligence still won't release full records on certain 1940s Arctic expeditions. Soviet archives hint at encounters with Axis forces in places they were never supposed to be. American files tied to early atomic espionage remain lost, despite digital tracking that suggests they were deliberately removed. Why? What could possibly remain so sensitive, so destabilizing that it must stay hidden nearly a century later? Is it about protecting reputations or hiding truths the public was never meant to know? Every locked file is a question left unanswered. Every redacted name is a thread severed. These aren't just bureaucratic oversights. They're choices, deliberate omissions that form the outlines of a much deeper, darker story. And the deeper we dig, the more unsettling the silence becomes. When the war ended in 1945, the world exhaled. Flags were raised, parades rolled through liberated cities, and soldiers returned home to heroes' welcomes. The story of World War II, as it was presented to the public, was one of triumph, the righteous defeat of tyranny. But not all stories were meant to be told. Beneath the loud applause of victory lay a quieter silence, cold, calculated, and absolute. There were operations so sensitive that no medals were awarded, no records were kept, and no graves were marked. Missions carried out in enemy territory that vanished without a trace. Units formed, deployed, and then dissolved, their personnel reassigned, their existence denied. Victory, after all, comes with a cost, and sometimes that cost is truth itself. In the months that followed the surrender of the Axis powers, intelligence agencies scrambled not just to claim enemy technology or scientists, but to clean up loose ends. Entire dossiers disappeared overnight. Cryptographers who had broken impossible codes were suddenly reassigned or retired. Field agents who had operated behind enemy lines simply never came home. Their fates unknown, their missions never acknowledged. These weren't accidents of record keeping. They were intentional erasures, buried under layers of bureaucracy, sealed in vaults labeled eyes only, lost in floods of post-war documentation. The world saw the fireworks. It never saw what was swept beneath the rug. And the more we learn about those hidden operations, the more we realize some parts of the war were never meant to end. This story is not about what's in the textbooks. It's about what was deliberately left out. Behind every official narrative lies a second history, one of covert deals, unsanctioned missions, and facts so uncomfortable they were buried before they were ever spoken aloud. This documentary opens the door into that world, into the shadows where documents vanish, testimonies are redacted, and silence speaks louder than truth. We're not chasing myth. We're tracing the outlines of real missions that existed just long enough to disappear. We follow the threads that remain, a mention in a classified memo, a photograph that shouldn't exist, a witness whose story was never allowed into the archive. These fragments, scattered and fragile, begin to reveal a pattern, a web of operations so extraordinary that their absence from history feels less like an oversight and more like a cover-up. Why were these missions erased? Who decided that the world should never know? And what happens when we start asking the questions they hoped would never be asked? This isn't just about the secrets of war. It's about how history itself is shaped, not by what we remember, but by what we're told to forget. In the early 1940s, with Nazi forces sweeping across Europe and North Africa, the British military faced an unthinkable scenario: the fall of Gibraltar. The Rock, a massive limestone fortress overlooking the narrow strait between Europe and Africa, was more than just a stronghold. It was the keystone of Allied naval intelligence in the Mediterranean. Losing it would mean losing visibility and, potentially, the war. That's when a chilling plan was devised. Deep inside Gibraltar, British engineers began carving out a secret chamber, invisible from the outside, unreachable without precise knowledge of its location. This was not a shelter or command post. It was a tomb, prepared in advance for 6 men who would be sealed inside voluntarily. Their mission, codenamed Operation Tracer, was to remain completely hidden if Gibraltar fell to the Nazis. Once sealed in, they would live for up to a year in silence, observing enemy activity through a hidden slit in the rock. No contact with the outside world. No way out. If discovered, they were to die quietly, taking the mission with them. The chamber was completed. Supplies were stocked. And then nothing. No public records, no confirmed deployment. Just silence. The kind that hints not at failure, but something too unsettling to ever confirm. For decades, Operation Tracer remained little more than a rumor, a ghost story whispered among military historians and amateur explorers. Official records were sparse. No one could prove the chamber even existed. Some dismissed it as a Cold War myth retrofitted into World War II lore. But in 1997, everything changed. A group of civilian spelunkers exploring a restricted area of the Rock of Gibraltar stumbled upon a sealed wall deep within a limestone tunnel. The masonry didn't match its surroundings. It was too precise, too deliberate. When they carefully broke through, what they found sent ripples through the historical community. A perfectly preserved secret chamber, untouched since the 1940s. Inside were rusted bunk beds lined in military fashion, a bicycle-powered generator, ventilation ducts, food tins, a small lavatory, and a narrow observation slit carved through the rock aimed directly at the harbor below. The room was silent, but it spoke volumes. How had this place remained hidden for so long? Why hadn't the British government ever acknowledged its existence? The answer wasn't forthcoming. Instead, the Ministry of Defense issued a brief statement confirming the room was likely associated with contingency planning during the war, and nothing more. To this day, no one knows if anyone was ever sealed inside. The equipment suggested readiness. The silence suggested something else entirely, a mission too strange to be forgotten and too disturbing to be remembered. After the discovery, historians searched for the human stories behind the steel-framed beds and dust-covered rations. Who were the men chosen for Operation Tracer? Were they ever actually sent into the chamber? Did they survive? Or were they entombed and lost to time? The answers remain elusive. A handful of testimonies surfaced in the years that followed. A former Royal Navy officer recalled hearing of a doomsday group assigned to a long-term Gibraltar surveillance mission. Another spoke of psychological evaluations carried out on soldiers for endurance beyond reasonable limits. Yet none of these witnesses could name the individuals involved. No service records, no family acknowledgments, no post-war debriefings. If these men existed, they were ghosts in the system. Why the secrecy? Perhaps the mission was never executed, and the erasure was simply due to bureaucratic embarrassment. And a reflection of how far the Allies were willing to go. But there's another possibility, darker and more unsettling. What if the mission was carried out and failed? What if those men died, not in battle, but in isolation, slowly wasting away behind a wall no one dared to reopen? It would have been a PR disaster in the post-war years, evidence of a moral compromise too bleak for the heroic narrative Britain wanted to project. In war, bravery is celebrated, but entombment, silence unto death, that's not valor. It's a sacrifice the world wasn't ready to acknowledge. So instead, it was erased, quietly, permanently, or so they hoped. By 1944, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from both the east and west, desperation pushed the Nazi regime into darker and more audacious territory. While the world focused on Normandy and the Eastern Front, something far stranger was unfolding in the dense, uncharted forests of Eastern Europe. The whispered tale of a train, unlike any other, moving in silence across the rails. Allied intelligence began intercepting odd transmissions, references to mobile laboratories, sudden spikes in fuel requisitions for armored train units, and high-priority cargo that never passed through conventional stations. Reports trickled in from resistance fighters in Poland and Czechoslovakia. They spoke of a heavily guarded convoy of dark, unmarked rail cars escorted by SS troops, traveling only at night and never stopping at public depots. What made this convoy different wasn't just its secrecy, it was the speculation around its purpose. MI6 analysts and OSS operatives began to believe the unthinkable, that Germany had constructed a mobile nuclear laboratory designed to evade bombing raids and move through territories with impunity, a roving weapons facility, one that could test and transport radioactive material without ever being anchored to a single vulnerable site. But if such a train existed, no photographs ever surfaced. No Allied unit ever claimed to capture it. And yet, fragments of evidence, intercepted messages, German logbooks, unexplained radiation sickness in occupied zones, all pointed to something real, something terrifying, something that vanished before the war even ended. Captured Nazi documents recovered from underground bunkers in late 1945 hinted at a nuclear initiative far more expansive than what was acknowledged at Nuremberg. Pages mentioned uranium shipments diverted from known routes, high-priority materials loaded on rolling platforms, and the sudden reassignment or disappearance of top physicists. Names like Dr. Kurt Diebner and Walter Gerlach appear in these records, associated with mobile research units and dispersed experiments. But many of these scientists, after the war, either fled, died mysteriously, or were absorbed into post-war programs under vague circumstances. Some never resurfaced at all. Even more chilling were the radiation reports. In small towns near the Carpathian Mountains and along the Polish border, locals spoke of illness and livestock deaths in the wake of strange train movements. Allied medical teams in 1946 documented unexplained cases of radiation burns in regions that were never targeted by bombing campaigns. The locations didn't match any known facility, but they did line up perfectly with the last known sightings of the so-called ghost train, a facility on rails, a laboratory that never stayed in one place long enough to be caught. After Germany's surrender, the Allies swept through former Nazi territories with one goal: locate and dismantle any remaining weapons programs. Dozens of underground labs were discovered. Uranium stockpiles were seized. Scientists were interrogated, recruited, or prosecuted. Yet the mysterious mobile facility, the nuclear train, was nowhere to be found. Soviet units combed the Eastern Bloc rail networks, searching for hidden sightings or buried rail cars. American teams questioned captured SS officers about moving labs or mobile enrichment units, but the responses were always vague, contradictory, or deliberately evasive. Some researchers believe the train was destroyed in the final weeks of the war, its wreckage buried beneath mountains, or incinerated by its own cargo. Others think it never truly existed, that the reports were an elaborate deception, a phantom to distract Allied intelligence. But then there are the witness accounts, survivors who claim to have seen a scorched rail tunnel sealed off by Soviet forces, or stumbled upon twisted metal, half sunken in swampy forests, glowing faintly in the night. And there's one more disturbing possibility, that the technology on board was so advanced, so beyond what the Allies understood at the time, that its discovery was buried intentionally, not to erase failure, but to claim victory in secret. If the train was found, perhaps its contents were never meant to be shared. Perhaps they were absorbed into darker post-war programs, erased from German history, only to reappear under different flags in a different age. As World War II escalated across the Pacific, the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA, began exploring unconventional methods of psychological warfare. Among the strangest and most chilling was Operation Fantasia, a covert plan to exploit ancient Japanese superstitions in a campaign of fear. Japan, a culture deeply rooted in spiritual beliefs, holds long-standing folklore about yurei, restless ghosts who wander the earth due to unresolved trauma. These spectral entities are feared as omens of death, vengeance, or dishonor. American operatives saw in these stories not just cultural nuance, but an opportunity. The plan was audacious. OSS teams, with help from anthropologists and folklorists, recorded haunting ghost voices in Japanese, distorted wails, pleading spirits, and eerie warnings of doom. These recordings were broadcast through hidden loudspeakers mounted in the jungle canopies near Japanese military encampments. But it wasn't just sound. Agents staged fake paranormal scenes, spectral figures illuminated in the night, unsettling talismans placed near camps, and the use of glow-in-the-dark paint to simulate ghostly apparitions. The goal was simple: induce fear, destabilize morale, and convince soldiers they were being punished by ancestral spirits. What sounds like pulp fiction was, in fact, government-funded warfare. And while it never appeared in official military briefings, some field reports hint at its deployment with disturbing effects the public was never told about. The consequences of Operation Fantasia were never formally documented, but the whispers that survive are disturbing. In letters intercepted post-war and accounts from POW interrogations, mentions of ghost sightings and unexplained mass panic began to appear. Entire squads reportedly abandoned posts after hearing curses in the dark. In at least 2 cases, Japanese officers allegedly took their own lives after being convinced they were cursed by ancestral spirits. These were men trained for combat, but not for the unraveling of their minds. Some began experiencing hallucinations, a detail corroborated by declassified OSS memos that noted the success of audio-based haunting interventions. But these same memos also advised discontinuing the program due to unforeseen psychological consequences. In the aftermath, some intelligence officials within the OSS began questioning the ethical boundaries they had crossed. Was this psychological warfare or psychological torture? The mission, though hailed internally as an innovative edge, was never officially recognized. No ribbons, no commendations, no formal acknowledgement that Operation Fantasia even existed. And yet, certain footprints remain. Military archivists have uncovered budget transfers to shell projects involving audio manipulation equipment and folkloric cultural consultants. Despite this, when pressed for details, the U.S. Department of Defense repeatedly denied that such operations were ever authorized. But denial isn't disproof. In the fog of war, truth is often rewritten. And when that truth crosses the line into madness, the first instinct isn't always to confess, it's to bury. Why would a mission like Operation Fantasia be wiped from official records? Some argue it's because it didn't work, that it was just a bizarre footnote in the catalog of wartime experiments. But others believe it worked too well, that the operation opened doors the military didn't know how to close. There's something uniquely disturbing about using a soldier's deepest beliefs against him, not with bullets, but with shadows. When you weaponize the spirit world, you blur the line between psychological warfare and spiritual desecration. The effects linger long after the sound dies out. Perhaps that's what made the operation so dangerous. It didn't just haunt the enemy, it haunted those who created it, the technicians who crafted the screams, the operatives who played the ghosts, the commanders who read the reports and wondered what they had unleashed. Some secrets are kept not out of national security, but out of shame. Because even in a war filled with atrocities, Operation Fantasia revealed a darker truth, that fear, when engineered with precision, can be more devastating than any bomb. And once you learn to summon ghosts, even fake ones, you may never sleep soundly again. In the shadowy forests of southwestern Poland, beneath the ancient slopes of the Owl Mountains, lies one of World War II's most chilling enigmas, Project Riese. The name means giant in German, and the scale of what was built beneath those mountains matches the name. A vast network of tunnels, bunkers, chambers, and shafts was dug into the bedrock, all with a singular shrouded purpose. Yet to this day, no one knows exactly what that purpose was. Construction began in 1943 as Germany's grip on the war began to slip. But instead of pouring resources into frontline defense, Hitler ordered an enormous effort focused on these underground fortresses. Some historians speculate it was intended to be a new Führer headquarters, a last stand redoubt. Others suggest it was a weapons development facility, a deep earth lab for secret projects too volatile or controversial to build above ground. The tunnels stretch for miles, cutting deep into the rock, reinforced with steel and concrete. Ventilation systems were installed. Massive elevator shafts were carved out, and yet it was never completed. Allied forces arrived before construction could finish, leaving behind a skeletal husk of something big, something hidden. But why so deep? Why in such secrecy? And why, even after the war, has no definitive blueprint ever emerged? What was Germany hiding beneath the mountains? And why does it still echo today? Project Riese was not just massive in scope, it was monstrous in cost. The labor was not volunteered, it was stolen. Thousands of prisoners from concentration camps, primarily Gross Rosen, were marched into the Owl Mountains under SS guard. Starved, beaten, and worked to death, they carved tunnels in suffocating conditions, often with only hand tools and rudimentary explosives. Very few survived. Estimates suggest as many as 13,000 perished during construction, their bodies dumped or buried in unmarked pits. And yet, for all the blood spent, the project was never finished, and its plans never found. Post-war investigations uncovered only fragments of documents. Blueprints were missing. Orders were vague. Even the Germans who had worked on the site claimed to know little about its intended function. Some theorists believe this is no accident, that the blueprints didn't vanish, they were removed, erased perhaps by Nazi loyalists in the final days of the war, or maybe by other hands after the war was won. Because whatever was being built down there, it wasn't just a hideout. It may have been a vault for knowledge, or a machine no one was ever meant to see. Decades have passed since Allied forces liberated the area, yet Project Riese remains as shrouded in secrecy as ever. Portions of the tunnel network are open to tourists, neat paths with guardrails and lights, sanitized and incomplete. But beneath the surface, there are entire sections still off limits, sealed by concrete, fenced off by military order, patrolled by silent guards with no badges, and no one can give a clear answer why. Local legends speak of strange vibrations deep underground, of electromagnetic interference that scrambles radios and GPS, while paranormal investigators who've gained a legal entry report sudden temperature drops, disembodied whispers, and the sensation of being watched. Skeptics dismiss this as folklore, but the Polish government stance only deepens suspicion because instead of dismissing the rumors, they refuse to discuss them altogether. So what lies behind the sealed doors? Some believe the Nazis buried experimental technology, early prototypes of weapons or aircraft, so advanced they bordered on science fiction. Others claim the tunnels hide something older, perhaps something discovered rather than built, a relic, a chamber, an anomaly too dangerous to unveil. What's undeniable is this: Project Riese wasn't just abandoned. It was locked away, and in a world obsessed with closure, the fact that no one has provided a full answer is perhaps the greatest mystery of all. After all these years, the mountain still holds its secrets, and no one seems eager to let them out. As the guns of World War II fell silent, a new war began, one not of tanks and trenches, but of secrets and sabotage. Fearful of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, NATO and the CIA initiated a plan that would remain hidden for nearly half a century: Operation Gladio. Its mission? Prepare for the worst by embedding covert paramilitary networks, sleeper cells, across dozens of countries. These stay-behind units were trained in guerrilla warfare, espionage, sabotage, and political subversion. Each unit was deeply compartmentalized, its existence known only to the highest levels of intelligence. Hidden caches of weapons and explosives were buried in forests, beneath churches, inside barns, anywhere that wouldn't arouse suspicion. Radio equipment and forged documents were distributed. Plans were rehearsed. Officially, their purpose was defensive. If the Soviet Red Army crossed into Western Europe, these fighters would activate, waging war from the shadows to destabilize the occupiers. But unofficially, the lines were blurrier. Some units began surveillance of domestic political movements, particularly those with leftist leanings. Others operated without any oversight at all. It was a plan born out of paranoia, but one that quietly mutated over time. The longer the Cold War dragged on, the more ambiguous the targets became. And though the world would not hear the name Gladio for decades, its fingerprints were already being left in places few were looking, behind locked doors, beneath quiet villages, and in the silence of documents marked never to be released. By the 1970s, whispers of Operation Gladio began to emerge, not from intelligence circles, but from courtrooms and crime scenes. Bombings, kidnappings, assassinations, acts long blamed on extremist groups, suddenly showed signs of darker origins. One case in particular shocked Italy. In the 1980 bombing of the Bologna train station, which killed 85 people, initially blamed on far-left terrorists, later investigations revealed traces of NATO-grade explosives and connections to right-wing paramilitary groups, some tied to Gladio's structure. The same pattern repeated across Europe. In Belgium, a series of brutal supermarket shootings in the 1980s left citizens paralyzed with fear. The attackers were masked, heavily armed, and made off with little money, prompting some to question whether the point had been chaos, not profit. Suspects linked to Gladio were quietly released. Files were sealed. Government scrambled to deny involvement. Yet in 1990, then Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti publicly confirmed the existence of Gladio, a bombshell admission that sparked parliamentary inquiries across Europe. Still, most nations refused to fully cooperate, and key documents mysteriously disappeared or were classified indefinitely. The critics argue that Gladio evolved into something far from its original mission, a tool for political manipulation. False flag operations designed to sway public opinion away from socialism and communism by creating fear and demanding order. Civilian blood, some say, was the ink used to rewrite the West's post-war narrative, and the people who bled were never meant to know why. Why were these networks kept secret for so long? The Cold War is over, the Soviet threat is gone, and yet, even today, Operation Gladio remains a topic governments refuse to touch. Requests for declassification are ignored. Key players have vanished, and those who speak out often find themselves discredited or silenced. Perhaps the most unsettling question isn't how Gladio operated, but who it really served. Was it a defensive line against tyranny? Or was it something else entirely, a shadow government willing to sacrifice civilians to preserve the illusion of Western stability? The deeper investigators dig, the more the lines blur between protector and provocateur, between soldier and saboteur. In democratic nations where transparency is celebrated, Gladio is a reminder of how easily fear can justify the creation of secret armies. Ones that answer to no parliament, no public, and sometimes no moral compass. And though its official purpose was to remain dormant until invasion, Gladio's true legacy may be that it was never dormant at all, just hidden in plain sight. In the bitter winter of 1942, as the world's attention focused on the bloodied front lines of Stalingrad and North Africa, a strange convoy departed from a quiet German airfield under the veil of darkness. Among the cargo, classified instruments, obscure scientific personnel, and something rarely used since the First World War, a Zeppelin. Its intended destination was not a battlefield, but the vast and merciless emptiness of the Arctic Circle. According to scattered fragments found decades later in abandoned Luftwaffe journals, the mission's objective was never clearly stated. Some entries reference geomagnetic survey operations. Others hint at the retrieval of ancient materials from beneath the ice, and then, more cryptically still, phrases appear like anomalous mass and non-terrestrial signatures. There were no official orders logged, no command structure publicly documented, and no confirmation that the airship ever returned. What is known, or at least whispered among military historians, is that the Zeppelin was equipped with experimental sensory equipment possibly designed to detect subterranean anomalies or electromagnetic disturbances. Accompanying it were members of the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi occult research division, the same organization obsessed with mythological artifacts and lost civilizations. But beyond these fragments, the silence is deafening. No photographs, no surviving crew, no recovery effort, just one more shadow in a war full of them. A mission to nowhere remembered by no one, or more accurately, a mission remembered by those who have been told to forget. Among the few pieces of data recovered from post-war intelligence seizures are garbled, half-faded radio logs attributed to the Arctic Zeppelin team. In these pages, signal operators record what they called intermittent polarity shocks, bursts of electromagnetic interference that disrupted instruments, erased coordinates, and distorted perception. One line, scrawled in haste, reads simply, "Compasses useless," lights behaving erratically, crew disoriented. More unnerving are the accounts, if they can be believed, of auditory phenomena. Voices in the storm, one entry notes. Another speaks of unidentifiable transmissions in no known language, reportedly captured on shortwave frequencies during a midnight whiteout. Whether hallucinations, atmospheric anomalies, or something more, the effect on the crew appears severe. Several log entries end abruptly, replaced by blank pages or unintelligible scratches, as if the recorder had descended into panic or madness. Conspiracy theorists have seized upon these fragments to suggest something extraordinary, that the Nazis weren't just searching for scientific data in the Arctic. They were chasing contact with something ancient or alien, buried in the ice long before human history began. Most historians reject this, but none can explain why the logs exist or why they were never meant to be found. To this day, no official documentation of the Arctic Zeppelin mission exists in German military archives. Requests to the modern German government for clarification are met with silence. The Luftwaffe has no record of a Zeppelin operation in 1942. The Ahnenerbe's expedition logs from that year are conveniently missing. Even Allied intelligence, usually meticulous in its documentation of Axis movements, contains only vague references, redacted summaries, offhand remarks, and files marked sensitive, do not pursue. Some point to the Cold War as the reason for the erasure. If the expedition had discovered something, ancient ruins, rare isotopes, or a magnetic anomaly of strategic value, it would have quickly become a matter of geopolitical secrecy, not a Nazi artifact, but a classified asset. Others argue that the mission failed so catastrophically it was buried out of shame, that the Zeppelin crashed, that the crew perished, that whatever they found drove them mad, froze them in the ice, or was never meant for human eyes. Yet the most chilling possibility remains that the mission succeeded, and the world simply wasn't told. Whatever truth lies beneath that Arctic ice, it's been hidden not just by one regime, but by every power since. And perhaps that's the real story. In the aftermath of Nazi Germany's collapse, the world rushed to claim its spoils, not gold, not territory, but minds. Operation Paperclip, launched by the United States, secretly brought over hundreds of German scientists, many with deep ties to the Nazi regime. They were placed in labs, missile programs, even NASA. Their pasts were whitewashed. Their knowledge became a weapon for a new war, the Cold War. But not all scientists were accounted for. Dozens of high-level figures, physicists, chemists, virologists, simply disappeared. Men with documented involvement in classified Third Reich projects, some even on Allied watch lists, vanished without a trace. No arrests, no trials, no relocation records. So where did they go? Some believe they fled on their own, slipping into South America through rat lines established by sympathetic networks. Others suspect something darker, that these men weren't missed because they were taken, not by the United States, but by other powers, Soviet intelligence perhaps, or by post-war organizations that operated outside national boundaries. A few names resurfaced decades later, quietly in strange places: Argentina, the edges of Siberia, even in whispers about Antarctica, places where oversight vanished and any experiment, any ideology could continue unhindered. These were not the scientists who were forgiven. These were the ones whose knowledge was too dangerous to admit and perhaps too valuable to lose. Across 3 continents, strange rumors began to surface after the war. Isolated facilities powered by strange machinery, uniformed guards who spoke German decades after 1945, settlements that appeared overnight in the middle of nowhere and then vanished just as quickly. In the Siberian wilderness, Gulag survivors spoke of a camp not listed on any Soviet map, one where the guards weren't Russian and the experiments weren't political, a place where whispers of cold fusion and time dilation circulated like ghost stories. The Soviets never confirmed it, but years later, satellite images would show unusual structures, and then, curiously, evidence of demolition. Far to the south, Argentina, long a haven for fleeing Nazis, saw the emergence of peculiar compounds in the Andes. Locals described foreign engineers arriving in convoys, guarded by men in black uniforms. Unmarked aircraft landed and took off under the cover of stormy weather. Government denials were routine, but whispers of Bariloche experiments continue to this day. And then there's Antarctica, a place with no native population, no accountability, the perfect setting for research beyond scrutiny. Declassified Allied documents mention post-war flights detecting heat signatures beneath the ice. Aerial photos captured geometric patterns in glacial regions where no human should have built anything. The official explanation: natural formations. But the question lingers: who funded this science? Who protected it? And what did these ghost cities achieve? Far from laws, far from witnesses. Long after the war ended, reports of ongoing experimentation filtered through the cracks, whispered by defectors, hinted at in declassified memos, but never officially acknowledged. These were not wartime atrocities revived, but something more evolved, more methodical, not for ideology, for results. Genetic manipulation, behavioral reprogramming, biological agents that didn't just kill, but altered perception, memory, even identity. There are documents, almost certainly incomplete, that reference selective memory extraction and consciousness transfer trials, too fringe to publish, too coherent to ignore. Some allege that time itself became an axis of experimentation. Devices aimed at disrupting circadian rhythms, or worse, manipulating localized time perception. Allied scientists reviewing captured materials deemed some of the theories incoherent or unprovable, then quietly filed them under restricted access. What's most unsettling is the lack of closure. None of this has an end point. There was no trial, no final report, no formal termination. The experiments, wherever they were, whoever inherited them, simply continued. And in a world increasingly obsessed with biotech and neuroengineering, the question is no longer whether this science was used, but how much of it we now mistake for progress. Long before Allied boots touched the sands of Normandy or the Pacific rang with the sounds of war, a quieter invasion took place, one that remains conspicuously absent from most history books. On May 10th, 1940, British troops launched an unprovoked invasion of neutral Iceland. No war had been declared between the nations. There was no official statement, no public justification, just silence and the cold precision of a preemptive strike. Operation Fork, as it was codenamed, was swift. Within hours, Reykjavik's radio station had been taken over, key ports secured, and Iceland's limited defenses overwhelmed without a single shot fired. The Icelandic government, caught completely off guard, protested the violation of its sovereignty, but to no avail. Publicly, Britain claimed it acted to protect Iceland from a potential German occupation. But beneath that veneer of security and strategy lay questions no one wanted to ask. Why Iceland? Why so early in the war? And why was the operation never commemorated, declassified, or even properly explained? This wasn't just an occupation. It was a race for something Britain believed Germany might already be after. The clues lie not in the invasion itself, but in what came immediately after. What happened behind closed doors following the invasion of Iceland remains one of the least discussed diplomatic episodes of the entire war. Within days of securing Reykjavik, British officials entered into secret negotiations with Iceland's leadership, agreements that would never be fully published, many of which remain redacted even now. Witnesses describe hurried meetings, escorted arrivals of scientists and naval officers, and the sudden expansion of British installations across the island, especially near geothermal zones and deep fjords. These were not mere defensive outposts. Something else was being sought. Declassified British shipping logs from 1940 mention Arctic magnetic calibration teams dispatched with high priority status. Strange cargo was unloaded under strict secrecy. British engineers built underground listening stations, ostensibly to monitor German U-boats, but according to internal memos, these sites were also collecting subsurface readings inconsistent with known geology. And then there's the question of what was already there. Some speculate that the British discovered early signs of a German presence, perhaps scouts or scientific teams mapping Arctic currents or monitoring northern lights for navigational anomalies. None of this was confirmed, but the frantic pace of occupation and the careful secrecy surrounding it suggests the British weren't just defending territory, they were seizing something before anyone else could. For decades, requests to access British government records about the 1940 invasion of Iceland were denied without explanation. Even basic communications between military officials were classified far longer than wartime documents typically are. It wasn't until 2020 that a tranche of these memos was quietly released to the National Archives, with little press coverage and even less context. What they reveal is startling. One memo, dated just days before the invasion, speaks of unconfirmed Luftwaffe flyovers and northern anomalies detected via hydroacoustic scan. Another references geothermal disturbance in coordination with unusual seismic profiles. The language is clinical, but the implications are hard to ignore. The British weren't merely concerned about German troops, they were tracking something else beneath Iceland's surface. Additional correspondence discusses the urgency of securing Arctic assets ahead of the United States, hinting at a deeper geopolitical scramble beyond the war itself. The documents stop short of detailing what these assets were, but the redactions, heavy and strategically placed, suggest that something tangible, perhaps even non-terrestrial, was under investigation. The silence that followed the release of these files was deafening. No commentary from the Ministry of Defense, no clarifications, just digital documents quietly added to a government database, and a long shadow cast across one of the war's strangest operations. Despite the vast libraries of declassified documents from World War II, there remain thousands of files sealed behind official secrecy, some locked away in vaults, others curiously misplaced or redacted into oblivion. These are not records of well-known battles or diplomatic exchanges. They belong to a different category: fringe technology, experimental warfare, psychological operations, and missions whose very existence challenges the conventional narrative of the war. Requests for access to these documents are routinely denied, not because they don't exist, but because their release is still considered a threat to national interest. And while the passage of time should have softened the need for silence, many of these files have had their classification extended multiple times. Take, for instance, the British Future Weapons Directorate memos from 1943, missing entirely from archives, despite being referenced in surrounding correspondence, or American OSS case files detailing behavioral interruption experiments sealed indefinitely under a Cold War era executive order. These locked rooms of history suggest something profound: that some aspects of the war were never meant to be remembered, not because they were failures, but because they succeeded in ways the public was never supposed to understand. And what lies behind those closed doors may rewrite more than just military history. It's easy to believe that secrecy serves national security. The classified files protect lives, strategies, and future interests. But what if the deeper function of secrecy is to shape memory itself? Collective amnesia isn't an accident. It's engineered, maintained, encouraged. Over generations, narratives hardened into truths. School books streamline the chaos of war into tidy victories and moral clarity. But the more we examine what's missing, the absences, the contradictions, the missions erased before they were ever known, the more we realize how much of our understanding is curated. We remember what we're told to remember. Why haven't these stories been investigated more deeply? Perhaps because they threaten the comfort of certainty, or because the powers that suppress them still linger in other forms, behind institutions, in classified programs, in invisible lines of influence that stretch from 1945 to now. When the public is fed a single version of the past, all other versions begin to seem implausible. Even when there's evidence, even when survivors speak, silence becomes a kind of glue, binding the preferred version of events until it's indistinguishable from fact. But silence, like history, is never neutral. It serves someone, and that raises the question: what stories were removed to make room for the ones we still tell? History is not a fixed ledger of facts. It's a living story, constantly rewritten, revised, redacted, and at times erased. What we know about World War II represents only a fraction of what occurred. The rest lies scattered in sealed vaults, forgotten airfields, unnamed graves, and whispered memories passed down through generations who were told never to speak. We think of war as linear, beginning with a declaration, ending with a surrender. But history is messy, asymmetrical, and some battles never end. Some missions never stop echoing, and some truths remain too heavy, too dangerous, or too disruptive to name. The deeper we've gone into these mysteries, the more one question has come to haunt this entire journey. What else have we forgotten? Not by chance, but by design. Maybe it's a weapon that was never deployed, a theory that crossed into the impossible, a disappearance that was too perfect to be accidental, or perhaps it's something larger, a different history, hiding just beneath the one we know, waiting to be remembered because when the vault finally opens, if it ever does, we may not just discover what happened. We may have to rethink everything we thought we understood.